I lost my son 11 years ago. That's what everyone believed, including me, for over a decade. But 3 days ago, my granddaughter and I sat across from a cardiologist in a quiet clinic outside Savannah, and when she stepped out to answer a call from her fiancé, that doctor leaned across his desk, lowered his voice to almost nothing, and said, "Mr. Whitfield, you need to get her out of that house tonight." Before I could ask him a single question, the door opened behind me, and my granddaughter walked back in carrying a small insulated lunch bag, and something about the careful way she held it made the blood in my veins turn to ice water. My name is Walter Whitfield. I am 68 years old, a retired Army logistics officer, and for 40 years I moved men, equipment, and supplies across 4 continents without losing a single soldier under my watch. I tell you that not to brag, son, but so you understand what kind of man I was before all this happened, and what kind of fool that same man became the moment it involved his own family. Before I tell you what I found in that lunch bag, let me tell you where this really began, because a man like me doesn't hand you the ending first without giving you the respect of the whole road that got us there. If you've ever had to protect someone you love from someone wearing the face of someone you trust, hit that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It means more to this old soldier than you'd believe, hearing from folks all over, at whatever hour it is where you are. 11 years ago, my son Daniel died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Charleston. That's the story I told myself every single day since, because it was easier than the truth I eventually uncovered, which is that my son did not die in that accident. He was murdered in it, slowly, over years, by 2 people who called him family. My wife Marion passed 6 years before Daniel's accident, and after she was gone, Daniel was the only family I had left in this world besides his daughter, my granddaughter Nora. Daniel married young, to a woman named Cheryl, and I'll admit to you honestly that I never fully trusted her, not because of anything she did in those early years, but because of something an old soldier learns to sense, the way some people's smiles never quite reach their eyes. But Daniel loved her, and Nora came along, and I told myself an old man's instincts weren't worth poisoning his son's happiness over. After the accident, Cheryl remarried within 18 months, to a contractor named Roy Ellison who did work on their house. I hated how fast it happened, but I said nothing, because Nora needed stability, and Cheryl insisted Roy was good to her, good to Nora, a real provider. I moved from my home in Georgia to a small house 15 minutes from theirs so I could be close to my granddaughter, watch her grow, be the one steady thing in her life that death and divorce hadn't already taken from her. For 11 years, I watched Nora grow into a remarkable young woman, 26 years old now, working as a physical therapist, engaged to a good young man named Trevor. And for 11 years, I never once suspected that the story of how her father died was a lie built brick by brick to bury the truth of what had actually happened to him. It started with something small, the way these things always do. 3 months ago, Nora came to me complaining of chest pains and a strange metallic taste that lingered in her mouth for hours after dinner at her mother's house. She'd been having dinner there every Sunday since she was a child, a tradition Cheryl insisted on maintaining even after Nora moved into her own apartment. I told her it was probably stress from the wedding planning, and she laughed and agreed, and neither of us thought another thing about it, because that's what you do when you love someone, and you can't yet imagine the shape of the danger standing right beside them. But the chest pains got worse. She started having heart palpitations at work, once so severe her supervisor called an ambulance. That's when I insisted she see Dr. Amos Bell, a cardiologist I'd known since he treated Marion years before her passing, a man whose judgment I trusted the way I once trusted a good sergeant's read on a battlefield. The air in Dr. Bell's examination room smelled like rubbing alcohol and the particular quiet of a place where people receive news that changes their lives. Nora sat in the chair beside me, her hands folded in her lap, that same insulated lunch bag resting on the floor by her feet, the one Cheryl had bought her years ago, and insisted she always bring her heart-healthy homemade smoothies in, made fresh every morning before work. Dr. Bell had ordered a full toxicology and heavy metal panel a week earlier, something well beyond a standard cardiac workup, and I remember thinking it was strange even then, though I didn't ask why. He sat behind his desk, scrolling through results on his monitor, and the longer he scrolled, the deeper the lines in his forehead carved themselves into his face. The silence stretched on so long I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then Nora's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, smiled apologetically, and said, "It's Trevor. I have to take this. Wedding stuff. I'll be right back," and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. The moment that door clicked closed, Dr. Bell's entire demeanor changed. The professional calm drained out of his face like water through a cracked pipe. He stood, came around his desk, and crouched down close enough that I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat off asphalt in July. "Walter," he said, his voice trembling in a way I had never once heard from him in 15 years of knowing him. "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not react." I sat frozen, the way you freeze when an explosion goes off close enough to feel the pressure wave, but you haven't yet processed the sound. "You need to get her out of that house," he said. "I'm looking at her results right now. There's arsenic in her system, Walter. Not a trace. A sustained building dose. Someone has been poisoning her for months." I felt the air leave my lungs like someone had put a boot straight through my chest. "That's not possible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I could hear how hollow they sounded. "She eats at Cheryl's every Sunday. Cheryl loves her. Cheryl's been feeding her nothing but healthy." "Keep her away from that house," Dr. Bell said, cutting me off, his eyes darting to the door. "And Walter, keep her away from that smoothie." The door opened. Nora stepped back inside, tucking her phone into her purse, that insulated lunch bag now in her hand instead of on the floor, and offering us both an easy, unbothered smile. But it wasn't the smile that turned my blood to ice. It was what was inside that bag. A single glass mason jar, filled with a thick, dark green liquid, condensation beading on the outside of the glass. "Sorry about that," Nora said, settling back into her chair. "Trevor's stressed about the seating chart. Mom made me this before I left the house this morning," said I looked tired. She unscrewed the lid, and a faint, bitter, almost metallic smell drifted into the sterile air of the room. "She's been so sweet lately, making sure I eat right before the wedding." For 3 months I had watched this ritual and felt nothing but gratitude for a stepmother who cared so deeply for my granddaughter's health. But sitting there with Dr. Bell's warning ringing in my skull, every motion Nora made lifting that jar to her lips felt like watching a slow-motion car wreck. I was powerless to stop. "Nora, honey, maybe hold off on that till we get the full results back," I said, keeping my voice as light as I could manage. She looked at me curiously but shrugged and screwed the lid back on, sliding the jar back into the bag. "Sure, Grandpa. You feeling okay? You look a little pale." "Just tired," I said. "Old man things." "Doctor." Bell excused himself to check on the labs, which we both understood was a lie, to buy himself a moment to compose his face, and I sat there in that freezing room holding my granddaughter's hand, my mind racing through 40 years of tactical training, trying to figure out how in God's name my son's widow could be poisoning the only child he left behind, and why. The ride home was a masterclass in me pretending everything was fine while my insides burned like a live wire. Nora drove, chattering happily about flower arrangements and Trevor's mother's opinions on centerpieces, completely unaware that the woman she called Mom had spent months slowly killing her. I sat in the passenger seat with that lunch bag between my feet, resisting the overwhelming urge to throw it out the window on the interstate. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, running through everything I knew about Cheryl and Roy, turning it over the way I used to study a supply route, looking for the ambush point nobody else had noticed yet. And that's when a memory I'd buried for 11 years surfaced with the force of a depth charge. The week before Daniel died, he'd called me late one night, his voice strange, tight with something I mistook at the time for exhaustion. He said he'd found some paperwork in Roy's truck he didn't understand. Something about a life insurance policy with his name on it that he hadn't signed up for, a policy Cheryl had apparently arranged months earlier without telling him. He said he was going to talk to a lawyer friend about it. 3 days later, he was dead. His car found wrapped around a guardrail on a road he drove every single day of his life, on a night with clear skies and dry pavement. I had never once questioned the accident report. I was a grieving father who trusted the badge and the paperwork, the same way I'd once trusted every intelligence briefing handed to me without demanding to see the raw data myself. But sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, feeling that same cold dread I used to feel before a mission went sideways, I understood with sudden, sickening clarity that I had buried my son based on a story, not on the truth. I am a man who spent 4 decades ensuring nothing moved without a paper trail, without verification, without eyes confirming what command wanted us to simply believe. and I had let my only son go into the ground without ever once asking who benefited from his death. I decided that night I was going to find out exactly what was in that mason jar, and exactly what had really happened to my son 11 years ago, no matter what it cost me to learn it. The next morning I called Nora and told her I wanted to take her to lunch, just the two of us, before the wedding chaos swallowed her whole schedule. She agreed happily, and while she was in the shower getting ready, I did something that still makes my hands shake to think about. I asked to borrow her car keys to move it out of the driveway, and instead, I opened the trunk where she kept a small cooler for the smoothies Cheryl sent home with her twice a week. I found 3 more jars, each labeled with the day of the week in Cheryl's careful, cursive handwriting. I poured a small amount from each into 3 separate travel bottles I'd brought hidden in my jacket pocket, resealed the jars exactly as I'd found them, and had everything back in place before Nora finished drying her hair. That afternoon, instead of going home, I drove 2 hours to a private laboratory outside Atlanta that I remembered from my Army days, a place that did independent toxicology work for veterans' disability claims, run by a woman named Diane Ferris, who I'd worked alongside briefly decades earlier, and who I knew still owed me a favor from a logistics mess I'd helped her out of back in '94. "Walter Whitfield," she said when I walked in unannounced, gray-haired and heavier than I remembered, but her eyes just as sharp. "Lord, it's been years. What kind of trouble have you found yourself in?" "The worst kind," I told her, sliding the 3 bottles across her desk. "I need to know exactly what's in these, and I need it kept quiet, Diane. Someone's life depends on it." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded once, the way soldiers nod at each other when words aren't necessary. "Give me 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest of my life since the day the Army knocked on my door about Marion's diagnosis. I spent them watching Cheryl and Roy with new eyes, showing up unannounced at Sunday dinner under the guise of missing my granddaughter, sitting at that same table where Cheryl had served my son his last home-cooked meals before his accident, wondering how many of those meals had been laced with the same slow poison now working through Nora's bloodstream. Cheryl was, on the surface, exactly what she'd always presented herself to be: warm, attentive, endlessly solicitous of Nora's comfort. She fussed over the wedding details, cried happy tears looking at dress photos, hugged Nora tight enough to bruise. Roy sat at the head of the table like a man who owned everything in his line of sight, talking loudly about his contracting business, about a new truck he was eyeing, about how good business had been lately, though I happened to know from Nora that his company had lost its biggest client 8 months earlier. "Business must really be booming," I said carefully, over dessert, watching his face. "Diversifying," Roy said, a little too quickly, glancing at Cheryl. "Cheryl's been helping me look at some investment opportunities. Smart woman, my wife." Cheryl smiled and squeezed his hand, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something calculating and cold that vanished so fast I might have imagined it if I hadn't spent 40 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker on the faces of men deciding whether to lie to my face. That night, back at my own kitchen table, I pulled out an old fireproof lockbox I hadn't opened in years, containing copies of documents from Daniel's estate that I'd never had the heart to look through after his death. I found the original life insurance policy Daniel had mentioned to me on that final phone call, a $2 million policy, taken out 18 months before his death, with Cheryl listed as primary beneficiary, and a rider that would have paid out even faster and larger if Nora, listed as contingent beneficiary in case of Cheryl's death, were to inherit through her mother rather than directly. I sat with that document until the sun came up, my mind assembling the pieces the way I used to assemble a battle map from scattered intelligence reports. Daniel dead in an accident nobody investigated too closely. Cheryl remarried within 18 months to a man whose business was quietly failing. Nora, the only other person standing between them, and full control of whatever remained of Daniel's estate, and the payout from that policy, slowly being poisoned in a way that would look, on paper, like a tragic and sudden heart condition in an otherwise healthy young woman. The next afternoon, Diane called me from the lab, and her voice had lost every trace of the warm familiarity from 2 days before. "Walter, where did you get this?" she asked. "Tell me what you found first." "Arsenic trioxide," she said. "Significant concentration. This isn't accidental contamination, Walter. Someone measured this out very carefully, dose by dose, in a way that would build up slowly and mimic cardiac deterioration rather than acute poisoning. Whoever did this either has medical training or did an enormous amount of very specific research. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached. How long would something like this take to kill a healthy 26-year-old? Depending on the dosing schedule, Diane said quietly. 6 months. Maybe 8 if her body fought it hard. Walter, whoever is doing this to your granddaughter is not confused or careless. This is methodical. This is someone who wants it to look natural. I thanked her, made her promise to keep the samples locked away and documented, and hung up the phone, standing in my own kitchen, shaking with a rage so complete it felt almost peaceful, the way the eye of a hurricane feels calm because of the violence surrounding it, rather than despite it. I could not simply confront Cheryl. I had no proof yet that would hold up to anyone but myself, and if I tipped my hand too early, she and Roy would simply stop, cover their tracks, and I would lose any chance of learning the full truth about what happened to my son. I needed to think like the officer I used to be, not like the grieving grandfather I currently was. I needed surveillance, documentation, and I needed to move Nora somewhere safe without alerting anyone to why. I called Nora that evening and told her I'd been having chest pains myself, an old man's convenient lie, and asked if she'd stay with me for a few days so someone could keep an eye on me. She agreed immediately, sweet girl that she is, packing a bag without a second thought, bringing along, of course, her insulated lunch bag with 2 more days' worth of Cheryl's smoothies inside, which I quietly poured down my kitchen sink the moment she went to shower, refilling the jars with a mixture of spinach, banana, and food coloring I'd bought specifically to match the color and consistency as closely as I could manage. With Nora safely under my roof, I spent the next 2 days doing something I hadn't done since my last deployment. I set up surveillance. I drove to an electronics store 40 minutes away, paid cash, and purchased 2 small wireless cameras, the kind meant for nanny monitoring, along with a receiver I could monitor from my phone. I told myself I was doing recon, gathering intelligence before committing to any kind of confrontation, the same discipline that kept soldiers alive under my command for 4 decades. I drove to Cheryl and Roy's house under the pretense of dropping off wedding centerpiece samples Nora had asked me to deliver, and while Cheryl was distracted in the kitchen fussing over the flower arrangements, I slipped one camera into the outdoor light fixture near their back door, angled toward the kitchen window, and a second into an old bird feeder hanging near their detached garage, which I happened to know from Nora doubled as Roy's home office and workshop. For 2 days I watched the live feed on my phone late into the night, my old soldiers' patience the only thing keeping my hands from shaking with fury every time I saw them together, laughing, planning, utterly unaware they were being observed. Nothing incriminating happened for the first day and a half, and doubt began creeping in at the edges of my certainty. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe grief and guilt over Daniel had twisted an old man's mind into seeing conspiracies where there was only coincidence. Then, on the second night, at nearly midnight, I watched Roy walk into his garage office carrying a small leather satchel I recognized as Cheryl's. He sat at his desk, opened a laptop, and Cheryl appeared moments later, closing the door behind her. The camera's microphone was cheap, tinny, but sensitive enough in the dead quiet of that late hour to catch fragments of their conversation. Still needs 3 more months of dosing before the cardiologist would even consider it consistent with organic decline, Roy was saying, his voice flat, businesslike, the voice of a man discussing a construction timeline rather than a human life. She's already having palpitations at work, Cheryl replied, and the warmth I'd watched her perform at every Sunday dinner for 11 years was entirely chillingly absent from her voice now. We don't have 3 more months, Roy. The wedding is in 6 weeks. If she dies married, that policy money gets tangled up with Trevor's family for years in probate. We need her gone before that ring goes on her finger. I sat in my car outside their house, my own blood running as cold as the metal frame around me, listening to my son's widow calmly discuss murdering her own stepdaughter for insurance money before a wedding could complicate the payout. And the old man? Roy asked. He's been asking a lot of questions lately. Showed up unannounced at dinner Sunday. You said he never suspected anything with Daniel. He didn't, Cheryl said, and here her voice took on something almost like pride, the kind of pride a craftsman takes in especially fine work. 11 years, Roy, and he never once questioned that accident. Walter trusts paperwork more than he trusts his own instincts. Always has. We just need to keep him thinking Nora's heart condition is natural, same as we kept him thinking Daniel's crash was an accident. I nearly dropped my phone. Every fear I'd assembled in the small hours of the morning crystallized into absolute, confirmed horror in that instant. My son had not died in an accident. My son had been murdered by these two people, and I had buried him without ever asking a single hard question, exactly as they had counted on. "How did you even manage the crash?" Roy asked. And there was something almost admiring in his tone that made my stomach turn. Sedatives in his coffee thermos that morning. Enough to make him drowsy, but not enough to show up on a routine talk screen if anyone even bothered to run one. Which nobody did because Walter vouched for how much stress Daniel was under at work, Cheryl said. Guardrail did the rest. I didn't even need Roy's help with that one. Just patience, and knowing exactly which curve on that road had the worst sight lines. I sat in that car for a long time after they finished talking, and the garage light went dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a force that would have snapped the wheel of a lesser vehicle, tears running down my face that I didn't bother wiping away, mixing grief for my son with a fury so absolute I understood. Finally, why some men in my old command occasionally did things in combat that violated every rule they'd sworn to follow. But I am, above all things, a man of discipline. Rage without a plan is just noise. I drove home that night and I did not sleep, but I did not act rashly either. I spent the remaining hours before dawn writing out everything I had heard, word for word while it was still fresh, and I called Diane first thing in the morning, asking her to also test an old thermos of Daniel's I still had in storage from his personal effects for any trace residue, on the off chance it hadn't been properly cleaned in 11 years sitting untouched in a box. I also called an old friend from my Army days, a retired military police investigator named Gerald Voss, who now consulted privately on cold cases and had connections with both local law enforcement and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, given how often insurance fraud and murder walked hand in hand. Gerald listened to my entire account without interrupting once, the mark of a man who had heard 1,000 impossible stories turn out to be true. "Walter," he said when I finished, "if even half of what you're describing holds up, this is a federal case. Not just a local one. Insurance fraud crossing state lines, premeditated murder, attempted murder of a second victim. But you need ironclad evidence before we move, because if we tip our hand too early, and she panics, she disappears, and you may never get justice for Daniel or protection for Nora." We agreed I would keep Nora at my house under the pretense of my heart concerns, continue swapping her smoothies for harmless substitutes, and let the surveillance run for one more week while Gerald quietly began working with contacts at the state crime lab to build a case that would hold up in court, all while I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, sit across from my son's murderer at Sunday dinner and smile. The following Sunday, Cheryl noticed something was wrong. I watched her face carefully as Nora ate dinner beside me, color in her cheeks, energy in her voice, none of the fatigue or heart flutters that had plagued her for months. "You're looking so much better, sweetheart," Cheryl said, and I heard the false brightness straining at the edges of her voice like fabric pulled too tight. "Are you still drinking your smoothies?" "Every day, Mom," Nora said cheerfully, completely unaware of the lie I'd built around her survival. "Honestly, I think staying with Grandpa's been good for my stress levels." Cheryl's eyes flicked to me, and for just a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and I saw something raw and calculating and afraid staring back at me. The look of a predator realizing its prey might be slipping from a trap it had spent years constructing. That night, the cameras caught Roy and Cheryl in a full-blown argument, their careful composure entirely abandoned. "Something's wrong," Roy hissed. "She should be getting worse, not better. Are you sure the old man isn't tampering with the smoothies?" "Walter doesn't know anything," Cheryl snapped back, though her voice cracked with an uncertainty I hadn't heard from her before. "He's a grieving old fool who trusts whatever story you hand him. He believed Daniel's accident for 11 years, without a single question." "Well, maybe this time he's not just believing," Roy said. "We need to accelerate. If Nora's improving, we push up the wedding interference. We tell them there's a family emergency, delay the wedding, buy time to figure out what's changed, and if we can't figure it out fast enough, then we handle it directly," Cheryl finished, and the flat, businesslike cruelty in her voice sent ice water through my chest. "The same way we handled Daniel." I called Gerald the moment I finished watching that recording, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. "They're planning to move on Nora directly now," I told him. "We're out of time." Gerald moved fast, faster than I thought federal machinery could ever move, calling in favors from the Financial Crimes Unit and the local homicide detectives who agreed, once shown the recordings and Diane's toxicology reports, to reopen Daniel's 11-year-old case immediately. Within 36 hours, We had a plan. Gerald would wear a wire and pose as a private investor. Roy had been courting for a construction loan, drawing him into a conversation that might yield a recorded confession, while local detectives quietly obtained warrants based on the surveillance footage and lab results to search Cheryl and Roy's home and financial records. I insisted on being present when it happened. Gerald tried to talk me out of it, citing regulations about civilian involvement, but I told him plainly that I had missed the chance to protect my son 11 years ago because I trusted a story instead of demanding the truth, and I was not going to sit at home while the truth about what happened to him finally came to light. 3 days later, on a bright, deceptively ordinary Thursday afternoon, I sat in an unmarked car 2 houses down from Cheryl and Roy's, watching through binoculars as Gerald's team, along with 4 unmarked vehicles carrying detectives and federal agents, converged on the property. Roy was in his garage office when they arrived, and through the small camera I'd planted weeks earlier, I watched his face drain of every drop of color as Gerald and 2 agents stepped through his door with a search warrant in hand. "This is a mistake," Roy said, his contractor's bluster cracking instantly into something small and frightened. "I don't know what you think you're—" "Roy Ellison," Gerald said, his voice carrying the flat, absolute authority I remembered from decades of watching him work. "We have recorded conversations of you and your wife discussing the poisoning of Nora Whitfield and the murder of Daniel Whitfield 11 years ago. We have toxicology evidence. We have financial records showing the insurance policy taken out 18 months before Daniel's death. You are under arrest." Inside the house, Cheryl had been in the kitchen, preparing what I would later learn was meant to be Nora's dinner that evening. A dish laced with a dosage of arsenic far higher than her careful, patient months-long regimen, clearly intended to finally finish what months of slow poisoning had failed to accomplish, once she realized Nora was improving. When detectives entered the kitchen with their warrant, Cheryl didn't scream or deny anything at first. She simply stood very still, staring at them, and I remember Gerald telling me later that her first words were chillingly composed. "I want my lawyer," she said, "and I want it noted that everything I did because Roy convinced me it was the only way to save our marriage from his failing business." Roy, hearing this through the thin walls as he was being led out in handcuffs, exploded with the kind of raw fury that finally cracks a mask years in the making. "She's lying," he shouted. "This was her plan from the very first day. She's the one who found the poison. She's the one who planned Daniel's accident down to the exact curve in the road. I just helped carry it out because I loved her, God help me, and she's going to sit here and try to hang it all on me." Cheryl's composure finally shattered at that, and the 2 of them screamed accusations at each other across the driveway, while stunned neighbors watched from behind their curtains, each one trying desperately to shift the full weight of 11 years of premeditated murder onto the other, the loyalty and partnership between them, whatever there had ever truly been of it, dissolving in real time into pure self-preservation. I sat in my car and watched it all unfold, and I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a hollow, exhausted grief for the 11 years I had spent visiting my son's grave, believing a lie. For every Sunday dinner I had sat across from the people who murdered him and smiled and passed the potatoes and thanked them for taking such good care of my granddaughter. The investigation that followed was extensive and, according to Gerald, one of the most methodically documented domestic murder for insurance cases his unit had worked in years, largely because of the surveillance footage and the toxicology chain of evidence I had built before ever going to authorities. Cheryl and Roy were both charged with the premeditated murder of Daniel Whitfield, attempted murder of Nora Whitfield, and multiple counts of insurance fraud. Facing the weight of recorded confessions neither could explain away, they eventually took separate plea deals, each spending their trial trying to paint the other as the true architect of the scheme, until finally accepting sentences that would keep them both in federal prison for the remainder of their natural lives. Nora's recovery took months, careful medical treatment slowly clearing the arsenic from her system under Dr. Bell's watchful care, and there were nights I sat by her hospital bed during the worst of the chelation therapy, holding her hand the way I once held her father's hand as a boy, terrified I was going to lose the last piece of Daniel this world had left me. But my granddaughter is strong, stronger than she knows, and she fought her way back to health with the same quiet determination her father once showed learning to walk again after a bad fall as a toddler, an old memory that came back to me during those long hospital nights and made me weep harder than I had in years. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, I stood in the front row of a small outdoor ceremony, overlooking the marsh grass outside Savannah, watching Nora walk down the aisle toward Trevor, her color fully restored, her eyes bright and clear and entirely her own. No fog, no fear, nothing left in her of the frightened patient who once sat beside me in that cardiologist's office not knowing her own life, was quietly being taken from her one careful dose at a time. After the ceremony, she found me sitting alone at the edge of the reception, and she took my weathered hand in both of hers, the same gesture her father used to make when he was young and needed comfort after a hard day. "Grandpa," she said, her voice thick with an emotion I understood completely because I felt it too. "I know these last months have been the hardest of your whole life. Finding out about Dad, almost losing me too. I don't know how you carried all of that and still showed up for me every single day like you did. You're all I have left of him," I told her, my own voice breaking in a way I hadn't allowed it to break in 11 years of quiet grief. "I failed your father once by trusting a story instead of asking the hard questions. I was never going to fail you the same way twice." She hugged me then, tight, the way you hug someone when words have run out. And over her shoulder I looked out at the marsh grass swaying gold and green in the late afternoon light, and I thought about my son, about the truth I had finally given him after 11 years of silence, about the daughter he had left behind who was standing here now, alive, married, safe, because an old soldier finally remembered that trust without verification is just another word for surrender. I think about Daniel every single day, son. I think about the years I lost believing a lie, and I think about the price my granddaughter nearly paid for my willingness to accept an easy story over a hard truth. But I also think about that Sunday, 6 weeks after the arrests, when Nora sat across from me at my own kitchen table, healthy and laughing, eating a meal I had cooked with my own 2 hands, and told me that whatever else this nightmare had cost us both, it had also taught her something her father would have wanted her to know, that love without honesty isn't love at all. It's just a very well-decorated cage. And I told her the same thing I'll tell you now. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching from tonight, trust your instincts when something feels wrong in your own family, because the people who count on your silence are always the ones with the most to hide.